Seran la Georgina Pujol, divulgadora científica i especialitzada en emergència climàtica, i el professor Tim Jackson, economista i autor de molts llibres de referència, com el Prosperitat sense creixement, que va publicar fa uns 10 anys. Jo soc en Rubén Suriñach, jo vinc de la xarxa d'Economia Solidària i des de la Fira Literal ens van invitar a dedicar 5 minutets previs en aquesta conversa per presentar-vos un procés que hem iniciat des de diversos moviments socials a nivell de Catalunya per construir un front comú de moviments per impulsar una transició ecològica justa, democràtica i ecofeminista. Vam pensar que era interessant perquè és un procés que s'està donant ara i que d'alguna manera venia a materialitzar en una cosa pràctica que està passant moltes de les inquietuds i de les alertes que tenim avui sobre la taula. Llavors, jo us faré 5 cèntims de què va aquest projecte i llavors si voleu més informació la busqueu. Aquesta iniciativa neix d'una campanya que es diu Futurs Impossibles, que vam impulsar al setembre de l'any passat entre la xarxa d'Economia Solidària, Coòpolis, que és un espai de promoció del cooperativisme a Barcelona, i l'Observatori del Deute en la Globalització. I el que volíem era agitar la conversa sobre els futurs que venen i sobre quines transicions ecosocials podem haver d'afrontar. Llavors, una de les eines que hem fet servir per agitar aquesta conversa és una cosa que en diem la construcció participativa d'escenaris de futur, on partim de 4 grans narratives de futur, 2 de no desitjables i 2 de desitjables, per veure el 2040 a Catalunya quins són les possibles bifurcacions, els possibles camins. Un dels escenaris és l'ecofeixisme, per exemple, que és l'escenari el menys desitjable, però també hi ha un escenari de decreixement, que és un escenari on la societat civil pren la iniciativa a l'hora d'abordar aquesta transició ecològica. Una mica partint de la base que la transició no és una opció, sinó que serà, des d'una premissa bàsica de realisme ecològic, una mica amb el que parlaven també l'Andreu i el Miguel abans. Llavors, aquests escenaris de futur ens estan permetent anar a molts llocs de Catalunya perquè les comunitats es preparin per als possibles escenaris que vindran. I des d'aquí emprendre accions per fer-hi front. Llavors, aquest procés, aquesta conversa, va tenir una fita bastant important el 23 i 24 de febrer a Barcelona, amb el primer fòrum català per la transició ecosocial, on ens vam trobar unes 300 persones de diferents moviments i col·lectius per construir un full de ruta compartit, un front comú de moviments socials per fer front a aquest repte que tenim a davant i incidir sobre l'agenda pública. Una mica l'objectiu també és sortir del món ecologista i fer que aquest debat sobre aquesta transició, sobre aquests futurs que vindran, interpel·li a la lluita per l'habitatge, al món feminista, a la lluita antiracista, al món sindical i d'alguna manera, entre totes, construïm una visió compartida de què hem de fer avui per caminar cap als escenaris desitjables. El fòrum aquest va servir molt per construir això, un full de ruta compartit, i està cristal·litzant en un artefacte polític que encara no sabem ben bé com en direm, però té números de dir-se Assemblea Catalana per la Transició Ecosocial. I en principi al juliol la constituirem i la idea és que això sigui un artefacte, un espai polític de la ciutadania, dels moviments socials, de la ciutadania organitzada, per incidir sobre aquesta agenda pública i avançar cap als futurs desitjables, als futurs possibles que volem aconseguir i evitar els escenaris pitjors davant d'aquesta doble crisi energètica i climàtica que tenim a davant. Llavors, us invito a visitar la pàgina web, és futursimpossibles.org, i si algú vol més informació, una adreça de correu ecologia@chess.cat. I res, jo sense més dono pas a la Georgina i al Tim i que gaudiu de la conversa.
Bona tarda. Bona tarda també als que ens esteu seguint. Mare meva, ara? Tot bé? També aprofito per saludar els que ens estan seguint des de casa via streaming i primer de tot presentar en Tim Jackson, que és economista ecològic i escriptor i des del 2016 és el director del Centre per la Comprensió de la Prosperitat Sostenible i professor de desenvolupament de la Universitat de Surrey. De fet, és la primera persona al Regne Unit que va obtenir una càtedra en aquest camp. Durant 30 anys ha estat al capdavant dels debats internacionals sobre sostenibilitat i ha treballat amb el govern del Regne Unit, la Comissió Europea, Nacions Unides, ONGs, fundacions, empreses privades. I avui ens presenta el llibre Postcreixement, la vida després del capitalisme, editat per Arcàdia i traduït meravellosament per Anna Llisterri, i ens ofereix un conjunt de reflexions apassionades sobre el fet que hem confós l'accés amb el progrés. I és una invitació a fer un canvi en l'estil de vida i en el nostre sistema econòmic i posar les nostres accions, els valors humans, les relacions al centre, més que no pas els beneficis econòmics i el poder. En Tim Jackson també, a banda de rebre diversos guardons per la seva feina com a economista ecològic, doncs també és dramaturg, ha estat premiat com a dramaturg i guionista de programes radiofònics de la BBC. Good afternoon, bona tarda.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here. It's fantastic to be in Barcelona. And thank you for coming to listen to me.
The first question...
I can't see the end of the room even.
It's plenty of people.
Yeah.
Good then. The first question, and maybe it's not easy to answer, but I think that it's basic to understand what are we talking about that is, or to understand the whole thing is, what is economic prosperity for you?
So prosperity, I would distinguish from what we normally think of as economic prosperity. Economic prosperity has conventionally been measured in terms of how busy the economy is. So the GDP is a measure of how much we're producing, how much we're consuming, how much people are buying, how much people are selling, how much we're making in the economy. And it's a good measure to understand how busy we are, but it's not a good measure of what I would call prosperity, of how well we're doing, how well our communities are, how strong our relationships are, how healthy we are, and indeed how much we're protecting or not protecting the environment. So, a part of my work has always been about redefining prosperity as something which is meaningful in terms of human progress, rather than this very narrow economic definition that we've grown up with. And it's very interesting when you think about the roots of the word prosperity, which comes from the Latin prosperes, in accordance with our hopes and expectations. So prosperity in that term means something very much broader than how busy we are in the economy.
Mm-hmm. Then I saw you in a talk in Chile, and you talk about the productivity labor. And I think that, if I'm not wrong, from the beginning of the 20th century till the 60s, it was growing, the productivity labor, but till the 60s started to decline. And then I would like to ask you, why did it happen?
So the growth rate in productivity was growing. So in the beginning of the 20th century, the productivity growth was about 1% per year by 1960. Actually, the peak, interestingly, is 1966. I don't know if anyone in the audience can recognize the relevance of 1966 for me as an English person sitting here. It had to do with a momentous event in world history in relation to... No? Really? We won the Football World Cup. And we've been trying to reclaim it ever since, but not with much success. Anyway, the peak of this particular curve, this growth in labour productivity, was around about 1966, the middle of the 1960s. And at that point, labour productivity growth was around 5% each year. And labour productivity growth is the foundation for economic growth. It's a measure of how fast we do things, how fast we create things. And since that time, it's been falling. And actually, just before the pandemic in the UK, labour productivity growth was virtually zero. So in other words, we're in the place where our labour productivity was almost turning the corner and going backwards. And that's a very difficult place for conventional economists, and very difficult place for the economy as a whole under capitalism, because labour productivity growth is a kind of foundation for capitalism, and when it stops working, then you start to get worried. Economists start to get worried, politicians start to get worried. Nobody entirely knows why that reverse has happened, why labour productivity growth has fallen. All we know is that it has happened. It happened in the UK, it's happened in the US, it's happened across the OECD nations, it's even happening in some of the emerging economies like China, where the growth rate has fallen. It hasn't fallen so far, but it's beginning to fall. And the most important implication of that is that we are essentially beginning to live in a post-growth economy, but we don't have the economics to deal with it. We don't understand how to make things work when we're living in that situation. And it's one of the challenges that prompts the work that I do.
Yeah, and in a way, maybe we are not completely aware about that, but I am earning less than my parents or my colleagues in my job. The senior ones were receiving more money than the money that I am receiving now, no? And this is happening, but we are not aware of that.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult thing for ordinary people to be aware of. There's a kind of sense in which you feel it, perhaps, in your working environment when you're expected to do more and more every year in the same amount of time. So, we expect our nurses to see more and more patients, our doctors to have longer and longer ward rounds, our teachers to teach bigger and bigger classes. This idea of more and more is built into our lives in a way that we may not always understand in economic terms, but actually the reality of it is kind of brought home to us on a day-to-day level by our jobs, by social expectations, by the language of politicians, always talking about productivity, always talking about growth. And a part of what I have tried to do, I guess, is to tease apart that language from the language of prosperity in this more meaningful, broader sense of the word. The point about wages is very interesting. In conventional economics, the wage growth follows productivity growth. So if productivity growth is going up, your employer can afford to pay you more wages. And when productivity growth falls, his profit margins are squeezed, there's less to go around, that has to be shared between the shareholders investing in the future and the wages that are given to people working in the country and in the company. And that then becomes more difficult to navigate. We find ourselves in a kind of tension between the owners of capital and the people who work in the economy. And actually, when productivity growth began to fall across the most advanced economies, that squeeze was mostly felt by workers, by ordinary people. It suppressed wage growth, not just to the level of productivity growth, but actually below that level. And what we found was that created huge inequality, because what productivity growth there was going to the owners of capital. They were very few people in society. And so you have this trickle up of economic wealth from the poorest in society to the richest in society. And you can see it. You can look at the statistics, and over a period from the middle of the 1960s, maybe early 1970s onwards, the bulk of the available economic growth was going to the richest in society. And the poorest were actually becoming poorer.
one of the ideas that I loved in your book, because I am not economist, but I see that the productivity labor can be distributed in other ways, no? Like, for example, can repercute to the consumer, or can you explain it?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, it's a little bit technical. So you have, if you can do more with each one of your workers, and imagine you're owning a firm and you have these workers who are working for you. If you can do more in each hour of their time, you can afford to give them a little bit more wages. You can afford to lower your prices so that things become cheaper, and that allows you then to sell more things and people buy more things. Or you can invest that margin in a new technology which will help you to get more productive again, so that if it works in that way, it's a kind of virtuous circle. Everybody wins. Even the shareholders can win. And when things get squeezed, then you find yourself in a situation where you have prices rising, you have a cost of living crisis, you have wages being suppressed, so it's even worse for ordinary working people, and then you forget to invest in the future. And that means that you don't have the technology that we need to get ourselves out of the mess or to make things better in the future. And the people who have the most power, of course, take the lion's share of whatever there is. And so the stock market can do very well, and the owners of shares can do very well. But the bargain between profit and wages, the bargain between the present and the future, is distorted by that process. And it's a part of why, for me, the problems that we face lie at the heart of capitalism itself. They lie in that idea of profit maximization through continual labor productivity growth. And we're already, as I said before, to some extent living after the best of those conditions. The world is not like it was in the 1960s when we had all this productivity growth and when our economies could grow at 5% per year, and everything was well for workers, everything well for capitalists, everything well for investment. We lost that sense of a capitalism that could enrich everybody. And it began to be actually a capitalism that could only enrich the few, sometimes at the expense of everybody.
But although it's like this that only enrich a few, I mean, people, I have this in my humble opinion, that doesn't want to change the system.
Sure.
Because they are comfortable, or what does it happen?
I think people, I mean, there is a genuine sense that people don't know how to change the system, particularly politicians. We live with this idea, this myth of growth, as I called it. And it really is a myth. It's a cultural myth. This is how we work. We grow. Everything grows. People grow, so it must be good. Of course, they only grow up to a certain point, and you wouldn't want them to grow any bigger as it happens. And after that point, they don't continue to grow. In fact, ultimately, and I'm sorry to break it to you, they're going to decay and stop and die and go away. Now, I'm not saying that's a model for our economy, but I am saying that this kind of myth, importing that idea of growth into the way that the economy should work, has been problematic, because we are now dependent on that kind of growth, and politicians are dependent on it. So there's a sense, if we're looking at it kindly, we could say we don't know what to do. I kind of wish people would say that more often. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to make an economy work when it's not growing. We don't know how to make a company work when it's not predicated on profit maximization. Actually, it's not entirely true. We do know some of these things, and we're beginning to find out the answers. And indeed, our moral obligation, in a way, is to find those answers and to find them quickly. But there is, in your question, there is a suggestion, and I think it's one that we have to take seriously. If you're looking at a system that seems as though it's totally dysfunctional for everybody, it's not working for anybody, then you probably haven't looked hard enough. There are probably people benefiting from it. And you can certainly find those people within capitalism. You can certainly find people who do not want that system to change. And sometimes for very short-term interests, sometimes for much longer-term interests, sometimes for some good reasons, and sometimes for some bad reasons, that they are profiting from a system that is dysfunctional for other people.
oil is the blood of capitalism, and it seems that it's going, or we are approaching its end. No? In your book, you name who murdered or who killed the capitalism, but is capitalism still beginning to die out, or does it still have many years of bad iron health ahead of it?
It's a very good question. Actually, just as I sat down to write the book, which was just before the pandemic, there was a meeting in Davos in Switzerland, the meeting of the World Economic Forum. And this is a forum that has always been at the heart of capitalism. It's always been a forum that at the heart of economic growth. And it's a place where the mantra of growth was kept alive for 50 years. But it was an interesting meeting for two reasons. The first reason is that capitalism had begun to clock the idea that it wasn't well received and that it wasn't necessarily doing the right things and that it needed some reinvention. So Mark Benioff, who is the CEO of an organization called Salesforce, was very famous at that point for saying capitalism is dead. But it was a strange way of saying capitalism is dead. It was capitalism as we know it is dead. Long live woke capitalism, a better capitalism, a different capitalism. And it was a sort of breast-beating thing, mea culpa, we must do better, we must reinvent capitalism. And the second strange thing is that within months, the artifacts of capitalism, the organization of capitalism, the smooth running of capitalism was dismantled systematically because we were in a crisis. We had to forget about the market. We had to forget about capitalism. We had to focus our minds and the government's minds on delivering livelihoods and safety and security and health for everyone and to protect people's lives. And so much of the machinery of capitalism actually temporarily stalled at exactly that point in time. It didn't stall for good. In fact, in some ways, capitalism reasserted its authority through the tragedy of the pandemic in a way that we have to think of as almost obscene. Because after the first couple of months of the pandemic, when the stock markets crashed a little bit and everyone rearranged things, somehow over the next year and a half, 2 years, the stock market went into the most incredible surge. So the values of stocks and shares rose and rose and rose, even as the wages of ordinary people went into decline because businesses were going out of business through the pandemic. And governments were propping up those businesses, but they were also propping up the stock market. And it was ultimately the stock market that did better out of that period of time when ordinary people were suffering. And so, to answer your question, it's clear capitalism is not dead. Capitalism was temporarily suspended, but it still has a force in our lives. And I think, you could then ask, why did I write a book with the title Life After Capitalism, which is a fair enough question. But to me, it's a process of thinking of ourselves historically, thinking of ourselves not as the people inside 21st century advanced economies that have always run this way and will always continue to run this way, but actually as human beings in social systems that change and change and change again, and recognizing that actually, particularly because of its dysfunctionalities, capitalism has to change, and we have to begin to think of this period of time as a historical one that worked for a while and then stopped working, one which we now need to change and don't know what comes next. So life after capitalism is a kind of invitation to think about what comes next.
How many years do you think that we will see this change? I mean, capitalism is not dead, but it is dying slowly. And what's next? What kind of economy we will have tomorrow? And how many years we will have
I think about 3.5. No, 3 years and 7 months. It's an impossible question. I'm not going to predict it. What I think is happening is that capitalism is already broken. You know, it's like, it looks like a shiny surface, particularly if you look in the right areas in the city or the right neighborhoods in the town where capitalism's benefits have been accrued. Then you could say, well, it's all shiny, it's glittering, it's wonderful, and all we have to do is do more of the same, and then everybody will be able to live like this. It'll be fantastic. But then you begin to realize that because of the dysfunctionalities inside it, it can never be the same for everybody. And it's not just about the fact that we can't afford that in planetary terms. It's because the construction of capitalism is undermining the things that support the lives of ordinary people. And it's a difficult lesson for us to look at and learn that our wealth, our happiness, our prosperity comes at the cost to other people. And so those cracks are already there, and those dysfunctionalities are already there. We don't know inside capitalism how to make a health care system work properly. And so that unless you have enough money to pay for it, you tend to be a second-class citizen in society and not even to have the basics to live well and to be healthy. And when you're looking at that, you see problems. When you're looking at the impact on the planet, you see problems. When you look at financial markets, you see problems. In fact, to some extent, it was capitalism that precipitated the financial crisis in 2008, because it legitimized easy money and it deregulated financial sectors to allow them to speculate around that money. It allowed them to lend money to people who they knew would never pay it back, and to rate those loans as if they were first-class loans and sell them on to other people without revealing that actually those loans would never be paid back. And so you created a kind of Ponzi scheme, a pyramid scheme within finance, and it was driven by capitalism. So all of these cracks are there, and we just don't know exactly when the bridge is going to collapse for us. But if we look around us, we find it's already collapsed for other people.
I think that the word degrowth scares people. Is this the reason why you decided to title your book Post-Growth instead of Degrowth?
I think the word degrowth has done a lot of good work. It's a challenging word. I mean, I think first of all we should recognize that we're in a kind of dilemma, so that growth, as we understand it, is unsustainable. Degrowth, as you said, is frightening. It's a place we don't know how it works very well at the moment. We can see some visions, but our economic institutions are not set up for it. And what degrowth does is it focuses our minds on a critique of growth. And I think that's right. That critique is necessary. I tend to use post-growth as a language a little bit more, and I used it for the book in this sense of thinking about what comes next. You know, let's free our minds from the language of growth. And even though post-growth doesn't entirely free us from that language, it does suggest there's a point where we might be free of it. So I prefer that terminology, but I have also worked very closely with people who work with the terminology of degrowth, and I can see for myself, actually, the enormous power that has, particularly for a younger generation, because they want to see that critique of growth, and they want a language that spells that out very, very clearly. And I think sometimes they don't necessarily know how to think or to articulate the economic aspects of degrowth. But what they do see is that it is a challenge to an existing system, and it's a very necessary challenge.
But is a rename, is the same movement that now is renamed, or flourishes in another way, or it comes from the degrowth, no? Or
yeah, it comes from a variety of different things. I mean, degrowth was talked about, back in the 60s by some French intellectuals. It was renovated, if you like, by Serge Latouche in France in around the early 2000s. That renaissance formed the basis of the degrowth movement, and it really is a movement now. And that movement has reached, amongst young people in particular, it's reached incredible heights. I was in Brussels for the Beyond Growth conference just last week. And to be honest, I was shocked. I've spent most of my working life feeling like I'm in the opposition, attacked by everyone, and so I use very, very careful language most of the time, particularly if I'm speaking inside the European Parliament, for example. The youth movement around degrowth has none of my timidity. They are articulate, sharp, angry sometimes, and they are calling for change with, a very loud voice right inside the halls of power. They're stomping their feet and waving their arms and putting their feet on the table and pointing the middle finger at the establishment, saying, you have failed, this is a time for change, and you must bring us this change. And so I think it has a sort of energy to it that actually is scary in a different way from the fact that we don't know what to do, because we've got all of this energy and all of this call for change, and we still don't know what to do. And so I think, that's a point where our strategy really has to the extent possible, step back from the language itself and not expect the language on its own to solve the problems, but to actually address in detail, in what does it look like in this degrowth society that we want? What does it look like to live well on a finite planet? What can prosperity possibly mean on a finite planet? And if we are guided by those questions and we articulate the answers to those questions in economics, in our understanding of ourselves, in our lifestyles, we are doing exactly what that call for degrowth wants, but we're doing it without necessarily needing either the language of growth or the language of degrowth, or even, ultimately, the language of post-growth. We are already in a situation when we're beginning to do that work, where we're beyond the kind of cultural myth that has trapped us for 60 or 70 years.
Can we flourish with economical growth? I mean, Joan Martínez Alier described your book una oportunitat per despertar i veure aquesta societat, aquesta economia contaminada, no? I buscar altres maneres d'entendre el progrés i la humanitat. But how can we flourish without progress?
Without growth.
Without growth, sorry.
Yeah, that is exactly our challenge. And it's a challenge that we have to be systematic in addressing. We have to think about what it is that we want as human beings, what matters, what sustains our life, what sustains our community. We have to think about our quality of life. We have to think about our care for each other. And we also have to dive right down into the values that support us. So 14 years ago, I wrote a book called Prosperity Without Growth, which was really an attempt to answer exactly that question. Can we flourish without growth? And if so, what kind of economy do we want? What kind of enterprise would give us this prosperity without growth? What kind of investment would give us prosperity without growth? What kind of work would we be doing in a situation where we had prosperity without growth? And some of the answers to that were very, very interesting and very, very obvious. If we move our economies towards labor-intensive activities, such as those in the health economy, the care economy, in education, in craft, in the creative sectors, these are very, very labor-intensive activities, and they don't have necessarily a huge material footprint. So you would ask, why could we not build our economy out of these activities? And we would have that idea of prosperity without growth. And the difficulty, and I think this is in a sense why I wrote Post-Growth 13 years later, is that those activities, the ones that we want for a sustainable economy, the ones that keep us well, the ones that allow us to flourish, the ones that look after us, And indeed, these were all the activities that looked after us when the pandemic struck, the really important activities. This is a place where you could build a new economy, where it could be materially light, it could be employment rich, you could have satisfying jobs, and those jobs would help other people. You would improve the quality of life. And you can construct the outlines of that from different places and points of time where economies have indeed tried to do such a thing rather than to pursue growth for its own sake. But the challenge, I think, is that that book was a report to the UK government. The UK government wanted nothing to do with that book, nothing to do with that report. They tried to pretend initially that it wasn't there. They tried to make it go away. And then there was what happened afterwards was extraordinary, because it was clear there was a public appetite to talk about these questions. And that's the appetite that made a momentum that was partly contributing to this rise of the degrowth movement, and in particular of young people and their need for change. And yet, one of my learnings from that was, first of all, we have to take seriously our structural allegiance to growth. We can't just turn off growth, turn around the corner, find ourselves in a degrowth land and celebrate. There is hard work along the way. And some of that work is economics. It's not something that politicians like to do, and unfortunately it hasn't been something that economists much like to do. They'd much like to believe in the eternal fairy tale of eternal economic growth. And at another level, apart from the hard work, I think it became clear to me between writing Prosperity Without Growth and writing Post-Growth that there's something deeper is needed, some deeper exploration of the values that underlie our society, the values around which we've constructed growth. And so in a sense, Post-Growth is a prequel to Prosperity Without Growth. A lot of the solution space is articulated in Prosperity Without Growth, the difficulty of the task has to be hard work that we engage in on the basis of some of those solutions. And the difficulty of the task is also about our values in society, the values of government. And those values are the ones that I wanted to interrogate in Post-Growth, to go a little bit more deeper, to be a bit more philosophical, to think about the roots of our economic understanding, to think about the roots of our politics and how we think of power in society, and to articulate that in a way that wasn't a government report. It wasn't written for policy. It was written for people. It was an invitation to a conversation, a deeper conversation about the nature of, not just the nature of our economy, but our place in the world, our place in nature, and our sense of where we are in the human condition in the 21st century, and where we need to change, what we need to think about as a realistic, meaningful, hopeful vision for a different kind of world.
And sorry, but I was hooked on the British government. Why didn't want the report at the end?
I can't imagine. I think. I tell you, a story of it was a government commission. It reported to the Prime Minister. We had road tested all of our work, our policy proposals, our arguments with every government department, and we thought we'd done all the work. And then I was walking home the weekend before the report was going to be launched on the Friday evening, with a sort of sense of kind of relief, apprehension, not knowing quite what would happen. But we'd spoken to many journalists. We'd spoken to every department. I had interviews with broadsheets. I'd already done half of those interviews. I had one more to do over the weekend. And I had invitations to news programs on the Monday morning when the report was going to be launched. And just before I got home on that Friday evening, I had a phone call telling me that number 10, which is what we tend to call the place where the Prime Minister lives, had gone ballistic. They had suddenly clocked that this report was coming out, and it was so counter to what the government was trying to do at that point in time that it was embarrassing to have this government advisory body talking in these terms, questioning growth, when actually it was the week in which the Prime Minister had invited all the G20 leaders to London to talk about kick-starting growth after the financial crisis. So I was not the best friend, and so there was an element of that. There was an element about not knowing what to do, and there is still, actually, if you listen to politicians, and in particular in the UK, there's still a kind of mantra: growth, growth, growth. That's what we will do. That will solve our problems. It'll turn the economy around. It'll fix everything. We will become Great Britain again. Never mind that we've slashed all our relationships with our trading partners and pissed them off in the process. We can still be Great Britain if we have growth, growth, growth. And I think, there are all sorts of legitimate reasons for that fear, that dismissal of the report at that time. And then there are some which I think indicate that politics, to some extent, still needs to grow up, to use a growth word in a way where it might be applicable. I think there's still something rather childish about the way we cling to myths and fairy tales when they're clearly not working.
Talking about politicians, el llibre comença amb en Robert Kennedy aspirant a la presidència dels Estats Units a l'any 1968, amb un discurs a la Universitat de Kansas en què explicava que el PIB compta totes les coses equivocades, des de la contaminació atmosfèrica a la publicitat dels cigarrets, que ara hauríem de dir, per exemple, la publicitat del Big Mac, dels McDonald's, no? Seria l'equivalent, que inclou coses massa dolentes, deia Kennedy, que fan que baixi la nostra qualitat de vida i que no compta les coses bones, com, per exemple, la salut dels nostres fills, el nivell de l'educació, la compassió humana, la saviesa que hem anat adquirint al llarg dels anys, en definitiva, que ho mesuren tot excepte les coses que valen la pena a la vida, no? He was already proposing to abandon GDP, but we are still hooked on it. When will it arrive the time to stop to venerate the GDP?
Yeah, that was a really interesting, I was fascinated by that speech in 1968 for all sorts of reasons. One, because it did trigger, it became a kind of poster speech for a re-investigation of the measurement system of how we measure progress. And one of the thrusts of Kennedy's speech was it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And he pointed to all the ways in which it covers up the destruction of the environment, as you said. And so that speech I had discovered maybe 10 years into my working life, I think. Someone discovered a tape of the speech in the basement of Kansas University, and all of a sudden we actually had, a major politician, a presidential candidate, saying the things that we had been saying as economists about the limitations of the GDP, and it was, it was fantastic. But I knew that little snippet about the measurement problem itself, and I knew that it was instrumental in a line of thinking that had questioned the GDP, that went from Bobby Kennedy to Joseph Stiglitz to the OECD's Beyond Growth program, thinking about measurement. And I wanted to know, when I was sat down to write the book, I wanted to know about the origins of the speech. I wanted to know where it came from. What possessed a presidential candidate in 1968 to get up in public on the first day of his presidential campaign and talk macroeconomics to his audience. And what was most extraordinary is that he got away with it. You know, he talked macroeconomics and they loved him. There were people hanging from the rafters to be in the room for that speech and to hear it. And they cheered the whole way through that speech. And I've listened to recordings since then. It was just an extraordinary campaign. And one commentator, there was one journalist on saying he's going all the way. He's going all the way. Very, very enthusiastic about the presidential campaign. And the reason for that enthusiasm was only partly about the measurement problem. I think that measurement problem is slowly being tackled. So there is actually a system of national accounts, an international system of national accounts, that is currently doing a revision of those accounts. And one of the things that it will look at is the GDP, this faulty measure. And the other part of Bobby Kennedy's speech actually was about the human condition. It was about poverties, not just in material terms, which the GDP can partly answer, but about poverties of dignity and meaning and purpose. It was a vision for a different kind of society. And it was that, getting a sense of that deeper underlying vision for society that I began to be, fascinated by, because I think, in a way, that has been a casualty in politics of the last 50 years. We have not had politicians capable of speaking in that way about a different vision of society for many decades. And that is a huge loss. And the sense, the sense of where that came from in Kennedy, it came from a sense of decency, it came from a sense of a fight against social injustice. It came from a deep affection for the natural environment, affection for nature. And it came from what I think, he saw as a kind of corrupt politics that had lost sight of human dignity. And it was a call that is as relevant today as it was in 1968.
Yeah, it was very shocking to realize this for me also. And I love to read that you were shocked also. I mean, Professor, you are a leading voice in the movement of economical system change. What should we measure instead of the GDP?
We should be measuring the things that matter, and ultimately what matters, of course, is human well-being. And human well-being can be defined in many, many different ways. I think one of the interesting things about the crisis was, the pandemic, was that it taught us how important health is. And it taught politics how important health is. But actually, ordinary people, when you ask them what matters in their life, it is often health that comes first. So if we want to be measuring something, then maybe we start with measuring our health, measuring our well-being, measuring our mental well-being, as well as our physical well-being, measuring our social well-being, the connectedness of our societies, because we know how much that matters to social cohesion and ultimately to our individual health. But we must also be measuring the health of the natural environment. So there are many, many things that we should be measuring. Some of them we are measuring. And unfortunately, and this is where the politics of it comes in, it is typically that one single measure of the GDP, which is not even a very good economic measure, which trumps everything else, and which means that we make poor decisions about healthcare, we make poor decisions about social well-being, we make poor decisions about the environment, and we continue to do that because we are fixated on this one particular measure of increasing monetary income. And so, the measurement question is a part of it, but it's a part that has some surprisingly simple answers. We know what to measure. We know what matters. We know what constitutes prosperity. And we do even have, inside our statistical offices, very good people who have put together some very robust ways of measuring those things. And what's lacking is this one simple step of putting those measures into our policy as a way of making decisions that improve well-being rather than just increase the GDP.
Could, for example, some experts say that we could measure the life expectancy of the country, or maybe the sustainability of the country. This could be a good way, I mean, to change the GDP for the life expectancy, for example?
I mean, life expectancy is one of those measures that matters, and particularly healthy life expectancy. If you have a healthy population that's living a long time, that's a really good indicator of prosperity in the country. And it should matter when, as is happening now, life expectancy is beginning to stall and even turn into reverse. You should ask the question, why is that happening, even though you're still trying to grow your economy? And when you look at the difference between countries as well, that's very, very important, because what you find, and this is an important lesson, that the post-growth message is not an injunction to poor countries not to grow. We're not saying to poor countries, we've had our growth, you have no right to it. Sorry, there's no more planet left. You just have to accept being poor and being unhealthy. That's not the post-growth message at all. The post-growth message is that there's a responsibility of the North, of the advanced economies, of the rich economies, to make room for growth in the poorest economies. Because when you look at the data, the relationship between life expectancy and income is very, very clear. In the poorest countries, getting a little bit more income increases your life expectancy massively. So between about $0 to about $15,000, $20,000 per capita, life expectancy almost doubles from 45 years in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa to around 80, 85 in some countries in Latin America. So this is the place where growth matters amongst the poorest in society. And then beyond that point, actually, we see anomalies. We see countries like Cuba and Costa Rica and Chile with life expectancies that are higher than the United States. And yet the income level of the United States is almost an order of magnitude above that in Chile.
Yeah, here also in Spain, our life expectancy is, I don't know, I can't remember the figure, but I mean, it's bigger than in United States, and in this case, we are richer than them, no?
In that sense.
In that sense.
Yes, yeah.
Exactly. I would like to talk about nature also. What do we have to do to convince the economies that the nature is part of the economical system also? Because I think that the GDP, the world GDP is like invested in nature is around 0.002%. I mean, it's a shame.
Yeah. I think in a way the climate change debate is a really interesting place to look at that, because there's one sort of fundamental argument that if you don't pay, you might not like the costs of paying attention to nature, but you are not going to like the costs of not paying attention to nature. You may not like facing the costs of reducing fossil fuels, but the costs of not reducing fossil fuels are going to be horrendous. And the Stern review, the Stern report in 2007, which was actually another report to the British government, and they did take it seriously up to a point, made that point very, very clearly. We fail to protect nature at our peril. If we don't pay now to create a sustainable world, we are going to have to pay massively into the future. And some of those costs are economic, and others of them are in terms of people's lives and their livelihoods and the food supply and the quality of the environment, the quality of the planet for future generations. These are huge, unpayable costs. And one of the ways that economics tries to get rid of those costs is by a process called discounting, which is similar to the process of kind of compound interest on on a savings account, except it works in reverse, that if you've got these huge costs in the future, then they're only really very small now because you can put that money into a savings account and eventually it will give you enough to pay for them, except we all know there are long periods of time in which savings accounts don't accrue any interest whatsoever. And actually, if we got the estimate of costs wrong, we will find ourselves with unpayable costs. Some of them may not be payable even with any amount of money because we've created irreversible changes to our ecosystems. And this is something, I think in some ways that is a message that's beginning to be understood, or there were periods of time at which it was beginning to be understood. It was definitely understood in the middle 2000s when for example, in my country, the Climate Change Act was passed, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was talking more seriously with governments about change. And all of these things, percolate very slowly through the political mind. And we certainly saw some reversals when Donald Trump withdrew the US from the Paris Agreement. You could say, yeah, we're stepping back. But the failure of politicians to address those long-term costs with short-term investments borders on criminality, and I think it will be looked on in that way in the future.
And what can we do, the people, with that?
You could do, I guess, I get to go back to the Brussels conference, and the biggest room in the European Parliament was packed, and with a very organized youth movement for climate, youth movement for protection of biodiversity. And they were loud, and they were insistent, and they were articulate, and they have been out on the streets demanding change. The COP process, the one in Glasgow, for example, very, very active youth movement presence at that conference. A voice that is coming from young people demanding change. There's also a voice that's coming from an older generation. Extinction Rebellion, for example, in my country at least, was a movement that didn't have that many young people. It had older women who had raised families, who were desperately unhappy that the world their kids were coming into was going to be unsustainable, was going to be catastrophic for those kids. And so that idea of actually getting up and making your voices heard is obviously one of the things that people can do, that they should do, that they are doing already. And even up to the point, and I'm not necessarily suggesting that criminality is the right way, but there is, within the Western political system, there is a democratic right written into the political contract for civil disobedience. Civil disobedience has a long pedigree in political thinking. And so that idea that we cannot talk, that we cannot make our voices heard, that we cannot stand up and be counted, I think is wrong. It's one of those impossibility theorems that people tend to throw at movements trying to articulate change. And that's a very important way of doing things, but it isn't the only way. I mean, we can, and when I talk to my kids about this, and my students, when I'm talking to them in class, what do I do, where do I go, what job do I get, how do I work in that job? There's no one answer, there's no one-size-fits-all answer to that, but the idea that we can be active citizens in our jobs, in our daily lives, in the way that we lead our lives, where we put our money, who we save our money with, what products we buy. This is a thing that people can do, and they can make their voices heard. It isn't, and you would tell me, rightly, that it isn't enough, and it isn't enough. We need that voice to be loud enough, those voices to be loud enough, and that activity to be loud enough that our institutions change and our politicians take leadership for the change in those institutions. And that demand for action, I think, is, that is ultimately the recourse and the right of citizens to demand that change, which is why those young kids, some people looked at that site last week and saw it as disrespect. But actually, it was an absolutely justifiable call for change. When our governments and our institutions no longer protect the welfare of their citizens, and this goes back to the political philosophy of John Locke, when that happens, it is the right of citizens to demand change from their governments.
How do you imagine the world after capitalism? Can you dare to tell us?
I mean, it is an imagination, it's an imaginary task that we all have to engage in, and part of the work of post-growth was to do that, and to do it in a way which in a way is different from the conversation that we're having here today. We're having a lot of the conversation that we're having is about the politics, it's about the economics, it's about structures, it's about institutions. The work of post-growth, the book to some extent does talk about those things, but it's also a task about imagination. It's a task about the values that matter to us. It's a task about what kind of world we want for the future and for our kids. It's an exploration of the human heart. Are we selfish, greedy, novelty-seeking consumers? Is that all we are? That's what capitalism tells us that we are. But it actually has a very poor foundation in philosophy, or in psychology, or in sociology, or in religion. Actually, it's well known that we have altruistic tendencies. We have kinder ways of being in the world. And it's well known that we care about tradition as well as the hedonistic frontier of novelty. And actually, in a sense, one answer to your question is what it's like after capitalism is that we become human. We become fully human. We allow ourselves the roundedness of the human psyche rather than the narrow constraints of a consumer ideology. And beyond that, I think it's a task that it isn't really one person's place to say what this world looks like, but it has more time for other people. It has stronger sense of community. It's not damaging the environment all the time. And we're not having to hide from the moral uneasiness that we feel that our success is only bought at the expense of our children or of poorer people in other lands. So it is a place, actually, I think, where there's a kind of another sense of richness, a richness of spirit, a richness of community, a richness of meaning and purpose, an ability to live full and meaningful lives without this cultural uneasiness that consumerism leaves us with, a kind of nasty aftertaste. I walked down to the harbour yesterday from my hotel, and I walked over the bridge, and there were people coming back from that big shopping centre on the other side of the bridge with bags where they were taking selfies of the brands, of the names of the shops that they had been shopping in. And some of them, you know, there was one moment where someone was taking a picture with this, and right at her feet almost was a semi-naked beggar who looked as though they were suffering in physical, mental, material terms beyond belief. And that is a contrast. That is a discord that our obsession with consumerism has made worse. And actually, you know, we can walk by it only so often, and it will go nowhere with us. You know, the brand names won't matter when we're on our deathbed. How we lived our lives as human beings, how we treated our fellow human beings, what we think of for our children going forwards, the kind of society that we created, the values that we espouse. This is basically all we can do with our lives. However much we shop, however much we work, however much we earn, none of that matters in human terms. And I think the ability to see, to just bring that into our consciousness and our conversations is a part of, I guess, what I'm trying to do in the book.
Thank you very much. These words are so inspirational. Your book is lovely, full of hope, And it's a big pleasure to have these professors, these intellectuals, experts, to talk about these topics that, as I said, gives us hope. Thank you very much, Professor Jackson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.